So I'm delighted today to be joined by Alexandra Chyczij and Lubomyr Luciuk. Luciuk. Right, I knew I'd get that wrong. Alexandra is president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and is a Ukrainian Canadian community leader and advocate for human and civil rights, the rule of law, and righting historical injustices. Organiser of legal conferences in Europe, USA, South America and the Caribbean, promoter of Canadian values abroad as an international election observer, and advocate for Ukrainian culture, identity and resilience. Well, fantastic. I'm delighted to welcome you both to the channel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
We're going to talk about a number of things, and we are going to end up talking about the current situation in Ukraine and trying to put it into a historical background. But let's start with the Ukrainian community in Canada. What is its scale, what's its strength, and actually how far back do its roots go?
Well, Jonathan, the beginnings of the Ukrainian community, at least in the historical record, start in 1891, so quite a long time ago, with the arrival of what we call the first wave of pioneer settlers. Some 170,000 Ukrainians came primarily from Western Ukraine to the Dominion of Canada in this period that lasted from 1891 to 1914, the outbreak of the First World War. Then there was a second interwar wave that was a little smaller, about 70,000 people. And then there was a third wave. That's the wave that our parents were part of, the post-World War II wave of about 40,000 people, displaced persons, political refugees, victims of the Second World War, people that suffered under both Nazi and Soviet tyranny in Ukraine. And since then we've had a fourth wave, that's the post-1991 wave. Then we've had a fifth wave that's coming now in these last few years. So in total there are now well over 1.5 million Canadians of Ukrainian heritage and almost 300,000 newcomers, as we call them, the fifth wave, who've arrived on a temporary basis as the war goes on in these last couple of years. So there's a long history of Ukrainian migration to Canada, both for economic and political reasons. And as a result, it's one of the largest Ukrainian diasporas in the world, rooted in Canada, which has maintained over 100 plus years now a strong link with the homeland. Primarily focused, there are cultural and religious links, but primarily focused on the notion that Ukraine deserves to return to its rightful place in Europe. That's the Ukrainian cause, the cause of Ukrainian independence and sovereignty as an independent state in Europe. That was, of course, achieved in 1991. It was threatened and partially undone in 2014, and then with the escalation of the war, the genocidal war against Ukraine in 2022 that continues, unfortunately, to this day, that has rallied this community as perhaps never before. Even as in the homeland, it's rallied Ukraine.
Well, Alexandra, this is an interesting question because my own family fled Central Europe and my other grandmother fled Ireland. Now, people who sort of move for economic reasons, not in the sense that it's sort of, warfare or displacement, let's say, from the Bolsheviks. Sometimes cultural values, even language, may not be passed over in the same way because people are leaving for economic reasons. Maybe they aren't coming from the sort of, the cultural elite or whatever of a society. Is this the same in Ukraine? In the different waves, you have different classes of people, and preservation of values can vary depending on which part of that diaspora you are. Or do we find that in the Ukrainian diaspora there is a certain sort of continuity and preservation of language, culture, values and identity?
There's no doubt that assimilation takes its toll on diaspora communities, but in the case of Ukrainian Canadians, the cultural aspects did persevere throughout the waves of immigration. And currently, many of the leaders in our community are actually the children or grandchildren of that post-Second World War immigration who came for political rather than economic reasons. They were political refugees. And I know from my own example, my parents' generation raised us in the spirit of preserving what might be being eliminated or annihilated in Ukraine, we were the genetic code that was to continue in the event of total Russification in the homeland. So for that reason, we have been able to maintain, and with successive waves of immigration, preserve our Ukrainian culture, heritage, identity, and history.
We'll come back to how that was injected back into a free Ukraine in 1991, but that preservation, is that language, is it culture, traditions, religion, does it reflect a sort of diversity of people from different sort of classes and backgrounds in Ukraine? Is it literary, or does this vary depending on the sort of family and their backgrounds?
I think it does vary, and certainly those who are second, third, fourth generation, many of them have different religious denominations. They don't necessarily participate in what are perceived to be the two mainstream religious affiliations, which is Ukrainian Greek Catholic or the Orthodox. We have many who are of the evangelical or Baptist confessions, but there is still a very strong Ukrainian identity that is rooted in the cultural manifestation of that and in the language. In fact, some of my friends who are second and third generation have taught themselves to speak Ukrainian because they lost that in the home.
And Lubomyr, this reserve of historical memory and memory of key events such as the Holodomor, which of course we know the Soviet Union was key to eradicate it, or at least, make it, or try to put a spin on the Holodomor that this wasn't actually a genocide, that this was purely political, etc. That of course happened during the Soviet Union. It happened after the Soviet Union collapsed to try and take the sting out of that. How do you see that reserve of historical memory? How did it endure, and how is it re-imported back into Ukraine? And is that the only reserve of historical memory, or are there parts of Ukraine and family connections that were able to still, preserve some of that, have a foundation when it did come to sort of re-import that back to the motherland?
Well, I think, Jonathan, that there are a couple of questions there. One is, each migration, each wave brought with it different characteristics. Some had come to Canada for economic reasons, but they didn't forget who they were. They maintained their faith, they maintained their language, they tried to maintain their culture, as Lash has pointed out. Others who came for political reasons, who had fought for the independence of Ukraine during the First World War period, or who were in the ranks of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army in the Second World War, they transmitted to their children this cause. You must prepare to fight for the liberation of Ukraine. And they told the stories about Soviet oppression, Polish oppression, Nazi oppression, about resistance. And they told stories, as you've mentioned, about the Holodomor. My own godmother, for example, told me about the Holodomor. It was difficult for me, frankly, to believe it, because it was not in the textbooks that I was taught from at high school or at university. I had good professors, I had good teachers. I don't blame them. But when I would raise these questions, they would say, well, that's anti-Soviet propaganda. There was this sense of a great Russia, which Lash has pointed out. There was a decolonization struggle on our part, a struggle for independence, a struggle for Ukraine's sovereignty. And it was obviously resisted by the Soviets, but also resisted by the larger society, which was often ignorant about Ukrainian history or indifferent to it. And sometimes at the higher levels, in media, in political circles, government, hostile to the idea that there might someday be an independent Ukraine. So when we come to 1991, and you see an independent Ukraine emerging from the deconstruction of the Soviet Empire, there was a lot of kind of hesitation. And then eventually it came into being, and people sort of accepted it in the West. But, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And everyone talked about corruption, and everyone talked about, how they weren't moving quickly enough toward democracy. I've said this before. when Moses led his people out of Egyptian bondage, they wandered in the desert for 40 years. And they wandered in the desert for 40 years because it took that long for the people who had been raised or schooled in captivity as slaves to get rid of it, that mentality. And it was only the next generations that got to the promised land, not even Moses himself. So today, Ukraine's Moses, Zelensky, is leading his people to freedom, to a place in Europe where they belong. And that's being resisted, not only by the relics of the Soviet mentality, but by, obviously, Mr. Putin, the KGB man in the Kremlin, who has this imperial agenda, and he's quite prepared to impose a kind of genocidal solution to the Ukrainian question, a final solution. In the diaspora, we were enjoined, we were trained, we were cajoled, sometimes overwhelmingly. So a lot of friends I had got out of the community because it was too political, because that's all we ever heard. You must maintain your language, your culture, you must maintain your distinctiveness. And as Lash has pointed out, assimilation is normal. People marry other people because they go to school with them, they're friends, they fall in love. It doesn't matter if someone's Polish or Jewish or Russian, Ukrainian, English, Scottish, Welsh. They marry. So what? Nothing wrong with that. But in our case, because Ukraine was enslaved, because Ukraine was occupied, because there was a colonization, an imperial project, a settler colonial project, as some people would call it these days, we were always told, you must maintain who you are. You must remind others of who you are, and you must struggle to achieve Ukrainian independence. When that independence came in 1991, some Ukrainians went back to Ukraine from the diaspora, but many of us were already too old or too established in our careers. So then it became a kind of an intellectual exchange. And there has been that. We have struggled. I mean, Lash was involved in the International Commission on the famine to tell the story in 1988 of the famine and to bring that back to Ukraine. And then scholars there and the community there began to revive those stories. There's still controversial issues. The nationalist movement in the Second World War, that's still controversial. That's fine. These are historical debates that we can have. But there's no doubt that the existence of the diaspora and of an organized diaspora through the Ukrainian World Congress, through the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, through the Ukrainian Canadian Congress Committee in the United States, through the Federation of Australian Ukrainian Organizations, all these organizations, the Association of Ukrainians in Great Britain, that the existence of these groups maintained, preserved, promoted the notion of, as I've said before, of Ukraine's return to its rightful place in Europe. And when the time came, we were ready. Not perfectly, and we didn't do it perfectly, but we were ready. And over the decades since 1991, there has been that exchange, and I think it has benefited both Ukraine and the diaspora.
Of course, Estonia seems to have had more preparation and done it a little more seamlessly, but of course it's a much smaller territory, so you can see how that would work. But let's turn to the thing that Estonians and the Balts have been warning us about for the last couple of decades since their re-emergence as European entities, and that is not to trust Russia. But they've been profoundly ignored. It seems the Ukrainians had a much more forward-looking, I would say, almost optimistic view that this is historical stuff and we're going to kind of move on. Whereas the Estonians are saying, no, this is something you really have to watch out for. And now we see this resurgence, dare I say it, of the sort of Soviet mindset blended with 19th century Russian imperialism or 18th century, whatever you want to call it. It's not just about crushing Ukrainian independence. It's about an extreme exertion of power and destruction of identities. Well, I'd like both of you to talk to this, but maybe start with Alexandra. How shocking is it, this resurgence of this Soviet genocidal imperial mindset? And do you think people in the West really have understood this in all its sort of toxicity?
I think there's a growing understanding of it, but the Russian oppression did not start in 2022 or in 2014. Ukrainians have been subjected to this for several centuries. The Russian Tsars imposed various anti-Ukrainian edicts banning Ukrainian language, Ukrainian books, and So we have been steeped in this knowledge of how oppressive the Russian, imperialist project can be. And Putin certainly declared this project loudly and clearly. If people had been listening and reading, we would have understood, that, and we know that Putin considered the disintegration of the Soviet Union one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. So the writing was on the wall, but there was perhaps a naive belief that this would never happen, that we would never see another world war in our time.
Let me add to that I think there's a couple of things that we need to be honest about. One is that, at least in my case, growing up as a young Ukrainian Canadian in a small city called Kingston with a tiny Ukrainian community, when I grew up, and there was, in a sense, no Ukraine, there was certainly no recognized Ukraine as such, there was a certain inferiority complex I had compared to my English or French Canadian or Welsh or Scottish neighbors, because I had no place I could call my own other than Canada, and yet I had the strange name of Lubomyr Luciuk. So I was clearly someone different from some place that no one really knew where it was. That's changed, of course, but and now, of course, the whole world knows about Ukraine as never before. But there was an inferiority complex, and there was a sense I had it well into my teens and into perhaps even young adulthood that somehow Ukrainians didn't fit in the real world. And I think that hobbled us to some degree. So we become quite insular in our communities. We would retreat into our communities and perpetuate our stories and tell our stories and resistance, resilience, all that stuff. But we were speaking to the converted. We also had a fundamental belief in the West and the free world being supportive of the Ukrainian independence struggle. And I think a lot of us were quite naive in that. We always believed that the Anglo-American world, or the free world, if you want to call it that, would support the struggle for Ukrainian independence. When you actually look at the archival record, that's not the case. The governments of Great Britain, the United States, Canada, were, as I said before, either ignorant and indifferent or sometimes openly hostile to the very notion of there being an independent Ukraine, because this was seen as a threat to the myth of a great Russia. Even in its Soviet cladding, this was Russia, and this was the land of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and the ballerinas and all that stuff. People didn't think about the colonial aspects of it. They didn't think about the genocidal agenda of the Tsars or of the Soviets. I remember Moroz, the dissident Ukrainian, telling me, it doesn't matter whether it's an Ulyanov, the Lenin, or one of the Romanovs. They're all the same. And at the time, I thought, wow.
Or a Karamazov, or Yulia Navalny, just to be controversial.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, but and I remember hearing him say that. No, that surely can't be, because I believed, and I'm going to say this, and I'll say it publicly because I think it's the truth. I thought one day there'd be a free Ukraine, there'd be a free Russia, and these would be neighboring states like Canada and the United States, and they'd have differences of opinion on things. They might have different political systems, but they would coexist in a free Europe. 2014 was shock number one. 2022 is a break. Ukrainians have realized that they never were Russians, aren't Russians now, never will be. Ukraine is united as never before. The world knows about Ukraine as never before. My neighbors, well, I'm here in London, but when I look out my window from my den at home, I look at my Scottish Canadian neighbor's flagpole with a Ukrainian flag on it. And I look down the street and there's another flag, and that's in a Welshman's house. It's incontrovertible that in the world today, Ukraine has never been better known, and that people appreciate the valor of Ukrainians as they contest Russian imperialism, Russian revanchism. And sadly, and I say this again with, mixed feelings, sadly, but Russia has now put itself beyond the pale. Because this isn't Putin's war against Ukraine. This is the Russian war against Ukrainians. This is what it is. It's existential. And so the only victory that can come from this war is Russia's defeat and dismemberment as the so-called federation.
And the last question here is, of course, that idea of radical fragmentation being the only way in which peace can come to the region, that is not only actively resisted, it is feared in Washington, Berlin, and I have to say, feared in London as well. There are only a few minds that see beyond that highly limited and, I would say, sort of managerial kind of mindset that doesn't see an opportunity in multiple sort of democracies or quasi-democracies emerging on the territory of Russian autocracy. The last question here is, you've described a sort of move from a Fukuyama version of history where everything's going to be liberal and lovely and rainbows and unicorns. We're now in a period of the return of history, read in tooth and claw, with these revived ideas of Kissinger type sort of spheres of influence and all this kind of stuff, balance of powers. It seems, though, that the patterns were there in history. The patterns of Western governments, whether it be the British government in the 30s covering up the Holodomor, not supporting Ukraine after the First World War and independence, whether it be the Bush's Chicken Kiev speech or Biden's half measures to allow Ukraine to bleed but not win, and now Trump. Actually, when you step back, there is continuity in
Absolutely.
not wanting a strong Ukraine to emerge. Could you both just have a brief word on that?
Well, I think that one of the themes that has emerged, certainly in Ukraine, is that of make Russia small again. It's a play on Trump's Make America Great Again, which is a recognition that only the defeat of Russia or Ukraine's victory will lead to lasting peace in Europe. And all of Europe is now poignantly aware of the very real possibility that Russia is going to expand its scope. The Baltics will be next. The Poles are terrified. We've seen, the resurgence of support after the shameful performance in the Oval Office, where Prime Minister Starmer and Macron and the Canadians as well and Europeans welcomed President Zelensky in a strong show of support for him and for Ukraine. And it remains to be seen whether there is a coalition of the willing, but it is now in Europe's interest to make sure that that happens because we don't know which way the U.S. administration is going to go.
Lubomyr, last word from you.
Yeah, well, what I would say are two things. One is I heard the same kind of anxieties in the late 1980s and early 1990s when Yugoslavia collapsed. That there'd be perpetual war, there'd be, ethnic cleansing, there would be no future for the states that might emerge out of Yugoslavia. And certainly it was a bloody war, I was there. That said, today, Croatia is a perfectly normal state in Europe. Serbia, I don't agree with its politics, but it's a perfectly normal state within Europe, etc. So the dismemberment of the Russian so-called federation, which is essentially an imperial hangover, is a good thing. I don't think it's something that needs to be feared. I think Ukraine will be victorious in this war, if only because they have no other choice. I think Ukrainians will resist the dismemberment of their state because that would only benefit the imperial Russian project and that would lead to future war. So Ukrainians really have no choice. They must fight. And when they win, well, I can be facetious about it, saying, we'll take Muscovy under our sphere of influence, but I don't think we want to. I think instead what will happen is that Ukraine will find itself, and I'm sad to have to say this, outside of NATO, probably within the European Union, but in a state of perpetual war. it will be the new Israel. And it will be a state that will be a nuclear state. And I've said this to you before, Jonathan, I think it was the 15th of November 1991, I actually wrote an opinion editorial published in the Globe and Mail in Canada, in which I argued that Ukraine might have to be a neutral state, but should retain its nuclear weapons. And no one listened. And then they signed the Budapest Memorandum because they believed in the so-called guarantees or assurances of not only the United States and the United Kingdom, but the Russian Federation, that Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity would be respected. They've since paid for those bad decisions with tens of thousands of lives. I don't think Ukraine will ever be the same. And I don't think that in the world we now live in, which is not the world you or I would have hoped for a decade ago, Ukraine will be as naive as it once was. And so the future is good in terms of Ukraine re-emerging to assume its rightful place in Europe, but it's not so good in terms of the kind of world that Russia has imposed upon us.
Alexandra, Lubomyr, I hope to continue these conversations in future discussions. For today, thank you so much for sharing this information, and of course it's great to see you in person here in London.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.